Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us. Have to admit, this is the first time I have presented in this forum, so I'm going to try and number one, stay on time, and number two, try and hit the right buttons. So, as Jen said, the project is a collaboration. Um, about creating a database for Gettysburg's Lincoln Cemetery. I'll leave all of the real content description to Andrew because he really is an expert on this. And Hader will talk about everything that it took to make the project come to life from a technical perspective. My role with the project is building on a lot of things that IT has done over a number of years. And just to give you a little bit of context, we run a number of non-paid and paid internships, some for credit and otherwise, where we look to provide students, sometimes often they're computer science students, but sometimes not, with really good project work to help them as they think about careers and then apply for either internships or first careers. Munya Choga, who you'll see on the bottom left, is the first person we really worked with 10 or so years ago. He came to us very interested in an internship in Goldman Sachs, for which he'd actually just been turned down. And he was turned down for the reason that he didn't really have the kind of project experience that they were looking for. So we started realizing, okay, there's an opportunity for us to do things to help students. And since then, we have done a number of projects. I've listed a few of them. Jen Flores helped us with Spanish language placement, rethinking some processes there that we do internally. Munya's project was around data risk analysis that we have at the college. The four gents at the right, Cale Murdoch, Danny Ziegler, Distanta Oha, and Chase Taberi, worked on a really cool financial services startup with an alum. I think it was a summer and a half ago. And then Bagench Atayef helped us with the Lincoln Cemetery database, and then we have Jivan, also Harel, who worked with us on the Gettysburg Black History Museum walking tour app. And we have a couple of interns who are going to work with Dishtanta also on a more history website in this coming winter. So we have a sort of students who need projects to help them on their career path. We also have community members who really we just get to know as through conversations and meeting folk. And my role is just to try and sort of bring the students who need to do projects and the community members who would like to have a project done together. So these projects really do take a community to support them. This project is a good case in point. It takes more than just the students and the client getting together. It needs quite a bit of support from experts all around campus. And RC, I have to point out, RC Meisler is particularly critical to this project. He worked with Andrew for a long time before I got to know Andrew on this project, and then really was critical in guiding us toward what technologies to use and sort of helping us get up to speed with using them, and was always a resource for Bagench and Hader as they went through their process. John Whitehouse does project management for us in IT and really helps sort of both customers, who really, Andrew was in the role of a customer, and the technology folk to work collaboratively together with with sort of timelines and benchmarks and all the kind of IT project management stuff that we do all the time in the college. Eric Ramey really provided the platform that we can work in, because we can't allow students into our production systems because there's too much sensitive data in there, and we'd fail all of our audits if we did. And so what Eric has done putting together the sites platform has allowed us to really do this kind of work. So with that, probably should mention a little bit about how the project got started and I got to know Andrew. Back in 2016, I think a lot of things happened around the country, made a lot of people aware of the role of monuments in the way that we tell stories about the Civil War and generally about the past. I had started to educate myself about how this works around Gettysburg and found some work that Andrew had done, which was hugely helpful. And then I discovered, lo and behold, he's a student, and found him out, and he gave me a lot of guidance and quite a lot of reading to do, as I recall, to come up to speed. And during those conversations, learned about the cemetery and his work on that, and that's really where this all came about. So then it was a question of pulling a team together, and Bagench was the first student involved. He's not able to join us for the presentation today. He's working for Microsoft, and they have him hard at work, so he's not with us today. And but one of the challenges of these projects is providing sort of continuation across multiple students who have to support the ongoing. So with that, I think I'll turn it over to Hader, who can talk about how he got involved and what the project looks like from his perspective, for which I need to stop sharing. There we
go. Okay. Okay, so hello everyone. My name is Hader Tariq. I'm an international student from Islamabad, Pakistan. I'm a senior this semester, and I'm a computer science major with minors in data science and business. So I have like more of a technical background. I worked on the project from February to May 2019, which was my spring semester of sophomore year. So I think I'll get into a bit about how I got to know about the project. So Gavin mentioned Bagench. He was an economics major, I believe, with some technical background because he took some CS courses. And he was a senior, so he was graduating. So that was keeping him pretty busy, finding jobs and everything, interviews, that kind of stuff. So he was also my roommate. So he approached me around, I think, January or at the start of February. And he asked me to hop in on the project and carry it till May. He still like contributed like till May. So it was a collaborative effort towards the end. And the goal from the technical aspect was creating this front end where the community could provide data they might have of any family history, lineages, relative data. And the goal also was to give the data back to the community that Andrew collected. So from the technical aspect, we used a software called Omeca S. So Omeca is basically a content management system, and as the name might give some clues of what it is, it's something that will allow you to handle all the content, but in more of a digital sense. So the most common word that usually goes around with content management system is collection. And when you think of a collection, basically a thing that pops up in your mind is the library. And that's where we actually heard about the Omeca S. So Mr. RC recommended, I think, Bagench, that he should look into this, and all the data that Andrew had related to the history he had collected, we had to like bring it into this Omeca S software. So Omeca S allows us to do a lot of things. Basically, the biggest one is that it already has this user interface that allows us to create this content and basically add or update as we want. So it's free, it's easy to use. I'll put some screenshots in the later slides so you can see how easy it is. And it's open source, which means you have the code and you can basically modify it to your use. So you don't have to like reinvent the wheel. You can just hop in and add stuff as you need to the source code. So one thing I want to mention is this thing called items, which is like the building block of this Omeca S software. And items, you can think of it as the content, and we'll get more into that in a second. So where did the data for this thing come from? So that's pretty much what Andrew was doing, I believe, since he was in high school. He'd been collecting obituary data and like birth certificates and death certificates, and also any like data living relatives had of their ancestors in the general Adams County area. So when I first met Andrew, I think it was towards the end of February or at least the start of March, he showed me the data and it was basically an Excel sheet. So, but we kind of went a bit like, you can manipulate Excel data. So the format we used was what's called the comma separated values, CSV. And as the name might also suggest, it's basically separating wherever there's a comma. So if there's this row called Joe Doe, 1934, 2002, and Pennsylvania, the computer just reads the first 4 letters, then sees a comma, so it knows the previous thing is 1 unit. Then it does the same with Doe, and it knows this is the last name, and this is the date of birth, this is the date of death, and this is the state where the date of death happened. So in general, that was the format, the data that Andrew had, and that's what we had to work with. Luckily, that's where Omeca S pretty much helps us out, because it takes a CSV file and we just fed that into it to create what's called items. So items is basically any object basically that you can define. So if it's a person, which is what this data basically dealt with, you have to ask yourself what defines a person. So a person has a name in this sense, the date of birth, the date of death, which state they were born, which state they died, and any relatives, any pictures that relate to like obituary data. So that's how you define one item. And you only have to define the item once, and then all of this, basically the computer does everything for you, because it knows where all these fields like first name, last name goes. So after you do that, you import the data and you essentially have a database in Omeca S. So I took this screenshot. This is the Omeca S user interface, and you'll see the small little menu towards the left. I want to just bring your attention to the CSV import. So we just used that to import all that file that Andrew provided us. And Began Chat basically worked on defining what the item was, in this case, a person. And once we defined that and all its fields like first name, last name, and date of birth, and etc., just imported, and we had this. And this is all the data that Andrew had, and it just goes on and on. You can see it's 443 items, and he pretty much collected all of that. So if you click on one of these people, it takes you to this item description page. It says items on the top, and this person's name is John Wilson. And these fields you see over here are all the fields Began basically defined for an item. You can see name of birth, name at birth, name at death, where the cemetery row is, grave number, birth country, father's name, mother's name, and spouse name, and it just goes on. And of course, death date. So, and this is just sources and notes. And over to the right, I want to bring your attention to the media. So we were also dealing with this data, And Omeca is basically allows you to do that. So it's a pretty cool software, I think. Okay, so eventually, once we had the data and converted into a database, we needed a front end to allow, remember the goal was to allow the community to actually search up people and get their details and provide data. So in terms of like searching up people in that database, we created this front end of a website, and you can do that using Omeca software. And over here, I just looked up a person called John Wilson, the one we just saw in over here. John Wilson. So that's the database, and this is a website, and you can look it up. The community can look it up. And this is the website providing all the details of John Wilson. So one of the last things I want to talk about is the WordPress. So I mentioned we also wanted to collect information from the community, both at Gettysburg and in Adams County, who have any data like news articles, pictures they have of their deceased relatives. So that we used another content management system called WordPress. I think people have heard about WordPress more often than something like Omeca is. And we used that WordPress to create the community website's front end. And just as I mentioned, this was the goal. And so this is what the front end of the community website looks like. You can see some of the features, like explore the database that takes you to that database web page. And this is where the key part of this website is the contribute information. You have to log in and create an account, and then you can provide any information you had on any relatives. They're like where they were buried, for example, and then that data basically gets added to the database. So as some reflections, I think I want to mention, like as an international student from a different country, Pakistan, and having spent at this time like 2 years in Gettysburg, I didn't think at the time there was much of a presence of African Americans in Gettysburg, but I do think like getting involved with this project kind of overturned that perception. Even if it is a small, there is like a considerable population of Black Americans who are here, and basically talking to them and like learning about their roles and influence and their lives in Gettysburg, especially in a place like Gettysburg because of its history, was like really interesting to me as a foreigner. So the last thing I think I want to mention is from the CS career perspective, creating the front end, handling the data, handling the integrity of the data. So any missing values, for example, get added in and they don't like cause any problems. All of that stuff really helped me out. And, you know, when you're giving like a CS interview, it's like the projects they focus on. They want you to talk about your projects. And this has really helped me in that sense. Yeah. So that's all I have. Thank you. And I think we'll take questions at the end.
Great. Yeah, I will try to bring my PowerPoint up now. Thanks, Haider. Thanks everyone for joining us today. I was really excited when Gavin reached out to me about presenting some of our research, and this was probably the most rewarding project I worked on during my undergraduate time at Gettysburg. I actually began the project in high school. I've been fascinated with our local history for as long as I can remember, and I've always felt that Black history has kind of been left out of the larger story of Adams County, and for many years intentionally. And I think, you know, in some cases, whoops, sorry, our heater here at the Historical Society is loud, if you can hear that buzzing in the background. Hopefully it will end soon. If not, I will move to a different place. But I'll speak a little louder maybe. I started this research, I think, when I was in 10th grade at Gettysburg High School. And then over the next few years, I gathered quite a bit of information about the individuals buried in Gettysburg's Lincoln Cemetery. So, you know, I have visited the cemetery many times, and it's actually locked. There's a a gate. So you have to speak with the gatekeeper, Betty Myers, if you want access to the cemetery. But I visited many times, and she took me through, and I was fascinated by the idea that there was this cemetery kind of off the beaten path here in Gettysburg that there wasn't a lot known about. So I started compiling basic information, the inscriptions on the headstones, collecting some obituaries and death certificates, and I started amassing a database of all the individuals buried there, and quickly kind of realized that quite a few, actually more than half, by the end of the project, I figured out that more than half of the individuals buried there don't have marked graves. So that was kind of a unique challenge. We don't know where probably 95% of these individuals are buried. And so, it was a challenge to find this data and not really know where the individuals actually are interred in the cemetery. I held on to the data for a long time and was kind of hesitant to put it out there because I do feel that, the story of our Black community, should be told by members of the Black community. And it's a very sophisticated issue of ownership and possession of this history. And I was hesitant to do anything without putting a lot of thought into it and talking with a lot of community members to see, whether this would be a useful tool. I actually was giving a program, I think in maybe 2016. Afterwards, a good friend of mine, Jean Green, who's on our board of trustees here, walked up after the presentation and she asked me to check a couple of surnames because I had mentioned in the program that I had been working on compiling a database. And I just pulled out my phone and typed in the surname, and one of the first names I read was actually the name of her brother who had died as a stillborn child. And she actually had not been told about what had happened to him and where he had been buried. And her parents, she was so young that they didn't really want her to know the story. And I was just blown away by that. She was in tears. I was almost in tears. And I realized that, there was a lot more meaning to this than just, putting names in a spreadsheet. So that's when I came across, a couple of years later, I think Gavin and I started talking about this, and I mentioned to him that I had the research, and we discussed how we could put it into this format. And I'm not a tech person, so I'm extremely fortunate that we were able to work with such a great group of people, Hayder and Begench and Gavin. So I just want to go through a little bit of information about my research on this and what ended up being the database. This is a map of Adams County from 1858, and imposed on the map are numbers of African-American residents in each town and township from the 1850 census. So you get a sense of, the Black community here in Adams County. There's several hundred at its peak in the, 1860s, 70s. It's kind of dropped off a little bit. I'm not sure what it is today. But at the time of the Civil War, there were about 200 African-American residents of Gettysburg Borough, and maybe about another 150 around the other portions of the county. You'll see quite a few in the western townships where it's more mountainous. And it was perhaps quite a bit easier to remain concealed for those who had escaped from plantations in Maryland and Virginia. But I like to point out that Gettysburg's Black community was quite a hybrid mixture of people of very different backgrounds. Some were escaped slaves, some were freed slaves from Virginia and Maryland, some were born free and ended up here in Adams County. Some were born as slaves in Adams County and then gained their freedom. There was slavery in Pennsylvania until the 1850s when the last slaves died. So it was a very, a community that was not at all, a monolith. And so, I found that very interesting. And I think that a lot of books and articles have tended to paint the Black community here with a single brushstroke. So, there's a lot of complexities here, and I won't, spend this time talking more about the Black community. I think there's a lot of other folks who are more knowledgeable than I am about it, but I did want to give you an idea. Obviously, the heavy concentration of African-American residents is Gettysburg, because that's where there was work, and there was a pretty significant Black community there all the way back to the 1830s and 40s. So Lincoln Cemetery is along Long Lane in Gettysburg near Rec Park, if you're not familiar with the site. For many years, it was kind of in disrepair. Betty Myers, the current president of the Cemetery Association, worked very hard to get funds to improve the cemetery, improve headstones, and currently the borough of Gettysburg maintains it. Technically, it's an abandoned cemetery maintained by the borough of Gettysburg. And they do mow and weed whack. But I know that Mrs. Myers is always looking for additional funds to help with specific projects. But before that, there was actually a cemetery on York Street in Gettysburg. Lincoln Cemetery, I may not have mentioned, was started in 1867 after the Civil War by a group of prominent town leaders, including some members of the United States Colored Troops, ex-Civil War veterans. So they established that new cemetery in 1867, and it replaced an existing cemetery that had been established in 1828 on York Street in Gettysburg. It's 311 York Street, right next to the bicycle shop. It's actually just a house today, and undoubtedly there are remains still at that site. I would, encourage at some point maybe some sort of excavation to determine what that consists of. But the cemetery was there from 1828 until 1906. At that point, the community decided to abandon the lot and sell it, and they moved about 36 bodies to the new Lincoln Cemetery. And actually, there were hundreds of people buried there. They supposedly moved 36 remains, but the process of moving remains was kind of haphazard in a lot of cases, not just with this cemetery, but with many of the town cemeteries. And so I'm sure that there was quite a bit missed. And of the remains that were moved, there may, it may have been more ceremonial in some cases where they would move just a shovel full of dirt or, some of the larger, pieces of remains. But so that's a very interesting story in itself. But Lincoln Cemetery, it was established by the Sons of Goodwill, a group of local Black residents that decided that there needed to be a larger cemetery for the Black community. Of course, most of the cemeteries, if not all, were segregated at this time. And so there was the need for a separate Black cemetery. And Black veterans were denied entry into the National Cemetery, the Soldiers National Cemetery. And so you'll see almost all of our local United States Colored Troops are buried still today at the Lincoln Cemetery. There was also a Catholic cemetery that bordered the Lincoln Cemetery, which is no longer there. Again, there's houses there now. And I believe there have been some remains discovered over the years. But Lincoln Cemetery, you can see here on this map, 1872, it's labeled Colored Cemetery. And it would actually expand and encompass the two lots directly to the west or to the left of where it says Colored Cemetery. So the sources that I was able to use to put this together, of course, headstones. 1832 is the earliest stone that had been moved from the earlier cemetery. Death certificates, that was actually something relatively new that was released on Ancestry.com a few years ago. They released the Pennsylvania state death certificates from 1906 to 1966. And by searching keywords like Black, Negro, Colored, African American, mulatto, I was able to find hundreds of death certificates for folks buried in the cemetery who were not marked who do not have headstones there today. Of course, there's also obituaries. The Historical Society has all of the local newspapers back to 1800. And so I was able to search pretty thoroughly through all of our local newspapers for references. Also estate files, wills, and other court documents associated with members of the community who passed away. A lot of times it would note the cemetery they were buried in. Then, of course, there's other documents like census records and court documents, tax lists. I tried to look at everything I possibly could so that we wouldn't miss many people. The headstone. So I already mentioned this, but there are 219 marked graves, but an additional 225. Actually, I think these numbers have changed a little bit. I think it's now 218 are marked. It's changed just slightly since I gave this presentation. I think we discovered one issue. But the question of how these individuals were identified, of course, the records were essential to that. This is just a screenshot from my computer of all of the death certificates, or just a section of them that I pulled from Ancestry.com that specifically mention where individuals were buried. Here's an example of a death certificate. This is Basil Biggs. I was excited to find this. It was one of the first ones we found. Basil Biggs died in 1906, the very first year they kept these records. And before that, before this certificate was discovered or digitized, we didn't know much about Biggs and his life before he came here to Adams County. You can see it lists his parents as William Biggs and Elizabeth Boyne from Carroll County, Maryland. So that was new information to us. Basil Biggs was a local veterinarian and was responsible for reburying a lot of the Union dead on the battlefield in the National Cemetery after the battle. We're really well-known local resident, and he lived on South Washington Street for many years. A lot of people know Biggs for his role in the Battle of Gettysburg, also for, he was supposedly involved with the Underground Railroad and lived out at the Crawford Farm during the Battle of Gettysburg, which is now the Gabor Borit residence. And it's a beautiful property and lots of history out there. So Basil Biggs has a wonderful story. We were able to add a little bit more to his story in this database. Here's a more recent death certificate. This one's 1938, Henry Clay. He actually lived just across from the college, right near where the financial aid office is. I believe that's what it is, the small house on North Washington Street. He lived there for many, many years, worked for the National Park Service. He was a messenger for the Park Service and was born in Illinois, actually born a slave, according to his obituary. We've never found a good primary source to verify that, but his obituary does state he was born a slave in 1845, perhaps not in Illinois. I don't think there was slavery in Illinois at that point. I could be wrong. But here's his death certificate, and we were able to learn more about him and add all of his information into the database. Here are a couple obituaries from local papers. So Margaret Palm was the target of a slave catching attempt in 1858 here in Gettysburg. This is her obituary from, I think, 1895 or 1896. We were able to add all these images into the database so that folks could access this information. And then Lloyd Watts on the right was a local school teacher and a United States Colored Troops veteran. And he has a wonderful story. We have some letters of his here at the Historical Society, but he is interred there with most of the Watts family. Again, another really prominent leader in the community. Here are some other examples of records. On the left is a vital record that we have here at the Historical Society. I believe it's a birth certificate for one of the Stanton family members. Then in the middle is a census record. And then on the right, a pension record for a member of the United States Colored Troops. We actually had volunteers many years ago who went to the National Archives and pulled the pension files for many of the United States Colored Troops from Adams County. And so that helped to add some more information to the database as well. So I did some statistics on once we had the full data set together. Kind of interesting. You see the birth decade for those interred in Lincoln. And you can see some of the really early individuals as well who were theoretically moved from the York Street Cemetery. There's one that dates to the 1760s. I may have frozen for a second, I apologize. Then here's the death decade. So you can see we do have our earliest burial is from the 1830s, but you can see there's a heavy concentration in the early 1900s that kind of trickles off as we progress. Then I did a little statistical analysis of the birthplace. As you can see, it's heavy on Pennsylvania, but a significant number of folks in the cemetery were born in Maryland. You have some from Virginia, quite a bit from Virginia, and then some from South Carolina, Tennessee, West Virginia, and Georgia. After the Civil War, you see more members of the Black community here from places further south than Virginia. It was a lot easier, obviously, for them to make their way north. But before that, we do see, even during the Civil War period, quite a few from Maryland and Virginia, either escaped slaves or folks who were set free. And then I did a heat map that shows the surrounding counties. So obviously you see a lot of Adams County individuals who were born in Adams County, but there are quite a few from Carroll and Frederick County, Maryland. That was a really large source of immigration in this community from northern Maryland into southern Pennsylvania. And then, of course, there are some individuals from further south in Virginia as well. Age at death is really interesting. So this is an analysis of the age at death. The average age of death was 49. I did not have a chance to compare that to the white community, but I would imagine it's considerably lower due to poorer conditions and institutional barriers. So you can see too, if you actually take the stillborn age away, I think it does go up to 54. But we do have quite a few, almost 60 stillborn children or children who died before the age of 1 who were buried in the cemetery. And I think probably 99% of them without any kind of marker or headstone. And then this is just kind of a synopsis of what is in the database. Obviously the name of each individual, location of the grave if we know it, some vital information like birth, death, dates, birthplace. Then we have some genealogical information if we could find it out, fathers, mothers, spouses, where the individual was born, if they were born in Adams County, and any attachments. If we could find an obituary or a death certificate, we attached it. I took a photograph of every headstone, those were attached. And then any additional photographs that we may have were attached. And we do continue to monitor to see if there are uploads. We've had a few people submit information so far, which is wonderful. And that really is the point of this whole project. So again, just I wanted to reiterate, this was an extremely rewarding project to be able to bring this information forward. And the real point was to allow relatives, descendants, and other folks interested in the Black community to have access to this information. I know that it's been very meaningful to some of the families to be able to access it. And it was a pleasure to compile it and to work with so many great partners. I should thank the Gettysburg Black History Museum. Jane Nutter and Mary Alice Nutter were very supportive of this project. They've been wonderful friends. Jane is now on our board at the Historical Society. And of course, Gettysburg College, Gavin and Biggs and Hayter were essential to this being successful. I probably never would have published any of this in this format without their help. I certainly wouldn't have figured out how to do it. So it was wonderful to have them involved. Also, RC has been the impetus for every project I've ever done at Gettysburg College. Without RC's expertise, none of this would have happened. And I still email RC when I can't figure something out or I have an idea and I don't know if it's possible to do in a digital format. So RC is a treasure at Gettysburg. I'm not sure if he's on the call. So this is a link to the website, actually to our website, where you can then click the Our Holdings tab and access the database. And I hope you'll check out the Historical Society. Many of you I know are familiar with it already. We are very busy right now. We're about to launch a major capital campaign and build a new home for the Historical Society. We're going to be announcing that in just a few weeks, but we're significantly into our fundraising for it. Actually, we'll be close neighbors of the college at our new facility. So I hope you'll check out our website and follow us on Facebook. We've been doing weekly programs throughout the pandemic, and we have about 1,000 members and about 25,000 followers on our various social media platforms. So it's a wonderful organization with over 1 million historic items that we preserve related to the community. And so we're always looking for more help and more knowledge and more community partnerships. So thanks everybody for listening. And I think I'll turn it back to Gavin for a minute if he wants to add anything else at the end. But again, my thanks to everybody who was involved, especially Hayter and Biggs.
Yeah, thanks again, Andrew and Hayder, for your presentations and obviously for all of your work on this. And it was just a delight to work on the project. So I'll open it up if anyone has any questions for us.
So if anybody has questions, just feel free to unmute yourself, because I think that's probably the best way to do it. Go ahead, Bill Bowman, hand raised, unmute yourself.
Yeah, I have a question I guess it's for Andrew in particular, but for everybody involved. I wonder, through all this research, Andrew, that you've done, have you also found information out about members of the Black community here in Gettysburg who were stolen away at the end of the Battle of Gettysburg? Are those some of the people who then eventually maybe made it back and were buried here? or I'm wondering if you can, I know you've done a tremendous amount of work, but maybe even expand this out, make that a kind of a next project, because we know about it as an incident, but I don't know if we know about the people and their eventual fate. And if you could provide any information on that, I think that would be great. But I want to second what Carolyn Sauter said in the chat box. I think this is a great project altogether. And it feeds in naturally to this more history efforts that's going on, not only here at Gettysburg, but at other places, which I think is, fundamentally important for a host of reasons. So let me congratulate you, but also let you answer that question. I guess a related question is, I think it's also really positive that you have now been working with the Black community here with the museum efforts too, and you brought some of them into your onto your board. I think that's also a really positive step. But so congratulations there as well. But I would like to know if you have any information about the members of this community who were taken away after the battle concluded or at the end of the battle.
Sure. Yeah. So we've actually spoken quite a bit about this here at the Historical Society. It's a fascinating topic. We know that there were African Americans that were stolen by the Confederate Army, kidnapped and taken back into Virginia and likely sold into slavery. We do not, unfortunately, know the name of a single person who falls into that category. I don't think that Adams County actually, I don't think there were many in Adams County. We had a very small population, and many of them, I think probably 90 to 95% of them left very abruptly when they heard of the Confederate advance. I know that in places closer to the Mason-Dixon line, like Waynesboro area, there were quite a few more who were taken. I think just weren't able to get out of the way fast enough. So that's a really great question. It's a wonderful story. What we do know about is there are two famous incidents of kidnappings earlier on. One I mentioned, Mag Palm from 1858, I think 58 or 57. And then there's another, Kitty Payne, who was kidnapped earlier. And she was actually, Mag Palm evaded capture by supposedly biting the thumb off of one of the kidnappers, which is a wonderful story. The other incident, Kitty Payne was actually taken, she and her children, to Virginia, and there was a court case there. And she actually ended up winning the court case and returned to Pennsylvania. What we don't know a lot about is what happened during the Confederate invasion. There is one topic, this is a little bit of a tangent, but there was a stream, as you may know, of refugees coming out of especially the Shenandoah Valley, both in 1862 during the Antietam campaign and in 1863 during the Gettysburg campaign. And we have a lot of articles about, bands of escaped slaves, freed slaves, and others who were moving north through, Waynesboro, Carlisle, Gettysburg, toward Harrisburg. And there was actually a Black community established in Harrisburg for these refugees. And we found quite a few articles in the newspaper about that community. I don't think there's been a lot of scholarship on that, but it would be a fascinating topic to look into. So I'm sorry I don't have a better answer on the actual identities. I wish we knew more about, I think it's without doubt that there are local Adams County African-American residents who were taken. We just do not know their names and their stories at this point. Oh, and I was going to just briefly address your other comment. We have not announced this yet, but we're also doing a special Black History exhibit with the Black History Museum in the lobby of our new building when we open. Our target opening date is about 2 years from now, Q3, Q4, 2022. So we're very excited to announce that. We'll probably announce that in January. And we're trying to work as much as we can with them and help elevate their message to tell these really important stories. I think there might have been a question in the chat. Let me look. Oh. I see someone's asking about volunteer opportunities or research opportunities. We are definitely interested in continuing research on the Black community. We don't have any current projects at the moment, just because we're actually so tied up with our capital campaign. And with the virus, we've had to eliminate a lot of volunteer projects for the time being, or at least put them on hold. But in the future, we certainly would love to expand it. We have a lot of records here, especially court records and local tax records that we could, certainly expand upon the database by going through additional records and pulling out names and families with additional information about when people were here, when they moved here, when they built a house, etc. So that's a great question.
I have a couple of questions / comments. The first one, I guess I'll send to Haider. You mentioned that you learned a lot about the content. How did the process of going through this project kind of help you learn maybe a little bit more about project development and everything?
So as I mentioned, I took the project in the spring semester of my my sophomore year. So I had like a couple of computer science courses, first of all, under my belt, but not like a lot. So when I first heard about like database, I thought, oh, that's a CS course you take way like up in your senior year. So maybe I don't have enough skills. So I think the first thing I learned, like a little like reflection thing, is that a lot of like software usually have like these interfaces that people build, like layers that you use now and don't necessarily have to deal with like the core topics. For example, the Omeca S necessarily doesn't do anything like make you write SQL statements, for example, to deal with the database. It just like provides you this user interface that does most of the stuff for you. So in terms of like the software development cycle, I do think I was at a point where Begench had done a good portion of it. So I had to like fill in the blanks, maybe you can call it. And this was my first project, like real, like I didn't had any internship experience or any other project. So yeah.
That's excellent. Now you have a product that you can show and say, I was a part of this, and that'll look great on resume and interviews too.
Yeah, and I think the last thing I want to mention is like the communication part. I mentioned like Begench and I were roommates, but still like there were some gaps in like the communication. We used to do, hey, is this work done? I signed it to you this date, is it done? I think that was one of the first things that came early on, that, hey, we have a little problem. Even though we're living together, we sometimes don't communicate, like you assigned me this job, but it's not done. So I think you would definitely agree, like in computer science, with communication is just so like it's so required. Like if you're not on top of things, you need to like verbally express that to your manager and let them know, for example.
Excellent. The other question was for Andrew and Gavin, possibly. I'm trying to remember back, and maybe it was 2 years ago. A student, Huang An, just did a program, did maybe a scan. I believe it was of the Lincoln Cemetery. RC, maybe you could jump in and confirm or deny that. But he did a kind of an aerial scan with a drone, I believe, and map things out a little bit, and then kind of put it into virtual reality. But that might be something nice to, at least maybe the scan and a general map might be something nice in the future to accompany this database, especially with the grave sites that are known, to kind of localize them, pinpoint them. Just a thought, and I'm not sure, I don't remember. I'm pretty sure that's the cemetery that Huang did, but Gavin, you're nodding, so I guess that's correct.
Yep, and that work is really interesting, and one of the things that I know Andrew has. I think part of my role as sort of bringing customers, folk with content like Andrew, and the technical team together, is to make sure we manage the expectations of what can be done in a certain amount of time.
Right.
And so we focused on getting into production with where we could get to in a given amount of time. That piece that Wong did a couple of years ago is really interesting, and I'll turn it over to Andrew because I know he's got various next steps for us in continued collaboration, and I know that's on the list.
Sure. Yeah, I think I would love to do a map, take the drone footage, the drone image, and put markers on each of the graves so that we really have a good sense. I think, I don't have any free time for this now, but I would like to eventually, there's a hand-drawn map of the cemetery that shows where some of the unmarked graves are. And I would really enjoy taking that map and going out there and trying to figure out kind of approximately where graves might be, and then marking those as well. So yeah, I think it would be wonderful to do that. One day we could maybe use ground penetrating radar out there and learn even more. There's a lot that could be done, I think. And there's a lot of things we need to do to better address Black history in this community, because it really has been kind of relegated to a side story, and that really is not, it's not in our best interest, and as we move forward to continue to keep that from having the spotlight that it really deserves.
So, as I mentioned at the top of this hour, we have a hard stop at 1 o'clock. So this might be a good time for us to close the hour. Thank you guys so much again for presenting. This was wonderful. And I invite all of you who are participating to please reach out to our presenters and connect with them, ask their questions, participate in any way that you can, and certainly visit the database, visit the website, and check it out. Also, I mentioned this is our last Friday forum of the semester. Another excellent semester of forums is in the books. Goodbye 2020. Thank you for helping out and presenting. And any and if you have colleagues or friends, or if any of you would like to present, we have our call out for spring proposals. So please reach out and consider talking in the spring. And everybody, if I don't see you before then, have a great break. Have a great end of the semester. Have a great holiday, whatever you celebrate, and get some rest, everybody. Thanks again.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Suzanne, for keeping us organized and making sure we got our stuff together. That was very, very helpful.
That's the least I could do. Thanks again for everything.
Thank you. Thank you,
Thanks.
Suzanne. Bye, guys.
Bye. Bye-bye.